I've been asked to talk about is juvenile court. And juvenile court is not court where I get to preside and make off-color remarks. That's not what juvenile court is. Juvenile court is for those individuals who are less than 18 years old who commit what we would consider to be criminal offenses. And I will get to that terminology here before long, but somebody else can play with that. Because I would, I have these things in the courtroom all the time, and technology, and it's wonderful. Most of the time. All right, so what is juvenile court? Juvenile court deals with those individuals less than 18 years old who have committed criminal offenses. And again, I'll get to the terminology here in a few minutes. Now, where does juvenile court come from, and what's the concept about? There's a concept in the Old English common law, judicial decisional made law, and it is a term and legal doctrine known as Parens patriotic. And that is Latin, literally, for parent of the country or parent of the fatherland. And the concept is basically that there are circumstances when you have individuals, many times applies to juveniles, other times to those that are intellectually disabled or in other unfortunate circumstances, where the theory is that the state has an obligation to step in and take care of its own, which is the aspect that juvenile court derives from, that in certain circumstances, perhaps some people don't do as good a job with their children as maybe they should, and they're going down the wrong path. And it's also applicable in another area of the law called dependency, wherein sometimes it's necessary and an obligation of those with the state to step in and try and get them on the straight and narrow, which frankly I will tell you with juveniles is often a chore. Juvenile court is a separate court from adult court. And in that context, they use a lot of different words for many of the same or similar concepts. Some would posit, why do we do that? That's silly. It's the same thing. What are you doing? And I'll give you some examples. For instance, in juvenile court, if you go out and you steal something, then you are committing an act of delinquency. If you're an adult, you're committing a crime. If you're a juvenile, an order to take you into custody is entered. If you're an adult, an arrest warrant is issued for you. In juvenile court, a petition for delinquency or to determine delinquency starts the ball rolling. In adult court, an information starts the ball rolling, informing you that you've been charged with the commission of a criminal offense rather than an act of delinquency. In juvenile court, we have an adjudicatory bench hearing instead of a criminal jury trial. We have a disposition of juveniles instead of a sentencing of adults. And we have detention and commitment of juveniles rather than sentencing them to jail or prison. Again, some people would say that's silly. It's wordplay. Why are you doing that? And the significance of that is, again, the doctrine under which that court operates is that sometimes you have to step in try to right the ship. And there are studies that show that many juveniles and certain parts of the brain of a juvenile are not fully developed in terms of their judgmental and good decision-making abilities. So these phrases are emphasized to try and help a juvenile get on the right path and to understand that there's a distinction between the types of people that you're dealing with. Though again, like I said, many times it is very difficult and a chore, because at the same time you're trying to make sure a youngster understands that he is accountable, but at the same time trying to lend a hand. And there's always a balance in trying to do that and trying to make a fair determination of when you've gotten to the end of reasonable assistance, wherein other things have to be done. In delinquency court and in adult court, we've got two concepts at play generally. We have rehabilitation and we have punishment. In adult court, the primary legislative policy and goal is punishment. This is delinquency. In adult court, rehabilitation is the secondary goal. In delinquency court, for a juvenile, the primary goal is rehabilitation, and then punishment becomes a secondary concern. In juvenile court, in trying to get a youth on the right track, depending on the things that they have done, there's various services that are in play and that the Department of Juvenile Justice tries to put into place to assist, and these are services having to do with mental health counseling, substance abuse counseling, sometimes anger management counseling, and many different other types of things. So the way it works generally, you would have an order to take a child into custody, and then they would go into, we would have a detention hearing, which is much like a first appearance hearing for adults, and then I would address with them what they're charged with, probable cause, their entitlement to an attorney, and the issue of their continued detention or their release. At that point, then we sometimes have diversion before there's even the filing of a petition for delinquency, and the diversion is a program where if they do certain things, sometimes similar to probation, but if they are able to successfully complete those things, then their charge will be dismissed. After that, if that's not occurred and a petition for delinquency gets filed, there's still the option for diversion, many times for juveniles, or if not, a plea agreement can be reached for juvenile probation when that's appropriate, after a juvenile has been given a number of chances, for instance, say at diversion, and has been unsuccessful. And then if there's no plea agreement, then we will have a bench trial at which the burden of proof is still beyond and to the exclusion of a reasonable doubt. With regard to a plea or a bench trial, depending on the finding of the court, either a plea or a guilt after a bench trial, occasionally a recommendation that there be a staffing will be made, will be given by the Department of Juvenile Justice. In other words, that's where all the parties and players get together, defense attorney, the state, counselors, DJJ representatives, DJJ probation officers. They'll get together with the professional providers, and they will make a recommendation to the court. At that point, depending on the recommendation, we'll have disposition, and sometimes it can still be diversion, and it can be probation, or it can be commitment to a facility in the custody and control of the Department of Juvenile Justice. And depending on the nature of the offense and the nature of the juvenile delinquency history, will many times bear on the level of commitment. There are many levels of commitment and services that they try to provide and to try and get young people on the right track. There are occasions for some individuals who are less, well, if you're less if you're less than 14, you're going to be in juvenile court. But there are occasions where people that are more than 14, there's a process that's gone through where these individuals can be charged as an adult, and it's not unusual depending on their delinquency history, the type of the offense, and what type of chances they've been given before. And the type of offenses that we have in juvenile court, they range the gamut. I have right now a juvenile that was under 14, shot somebody with an attempted murder case. The state cannot charge that person as an adult. I also have school fights. What I would have considered when I was younger, the run-of-the-mill school fights in the cafeteria. You flicked my ear or gave me what we used to call a flat tire on your shoe. And well, we're just going to fight about that. And believe it or not, that gets in juvenile court, and sometimes I'll look over at the state like I'm doing right now and go, really? But it gets to juvenile court now because in our time, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, putting a board on a young kid's behind, some people find that questionable. So they end up in regular court, and I deal with them. And so the juvenile delinquency court, it is a challenging court. And frankly, I would say it's probably one of the more challenging things that I do, because you're dealing with a juvenile, and sometimes you're dealing with parents who may as well be juveniles. And that's just the unfortunate reality. And so you're always trying to cut a fine line of making sure they're accountable and trying to recognize where you got to try and help them. And at that same time, recognizing why the apple sometimes doesn't fall far from the tree. So we try to help them where we can, and where we can't, they get committed and they're held accountable, and we try to provide them services in that setting. And then for some, unfortunately, they make some decisions from which you can't return sometimes, and they end up in adult court. And it occurred to me, there was a young man recently, only 18 years old. I did what I could, yelled at him as much as I could in juvenile court, tried to scare him. Somebody that I had some familiarity with. And it didn't work out. And he's doing 30 months DOC as an 18-year-old. So we try to avoid that as much as possible. But sometimes those things happen, and sometimes they're appropriate. So, as Forrest Gump said, that's all I've got to say about that. So if anybody's got any questions briefly, or I don't know if they want to do questions or wait till the end, and because I probably went on a little bit longer than I probably should have, but I did keep it to under an hour. Any questions? All right, it's always a pleasure to try and meet with people. Enjoy.
I got a question.
No. Overruled. It's got to be relevant.
Yes, it is. Did you ever feel the board on your behind?
No, because I was the perfect child. All right, any other questions? All right, thank you all.